Hello, good morning. My name is Ana Elena González Treviño, and I am the director of the Center for Mexican Studies of the National Autonomous University of Mexico in the United Kingdom. It is my great pleasure to introduce Sir John Elliott today, who is going to talk to us about a range of topics. But first, I'm going to introduce him. He has a fantastic career in the realm of history, especially the history of the Spanish Empire. He is Regius Professor Emeritus of Modern History at the University of Oxford. In 1949, he went up to Cambridge as an undergraduate at Trinity College, where he read history. Subsequently, he became a research student and then a junior research fellow at Trinity, and later a teaching fellow on his appointment to a university lectureship in history. From 1968 until 1973, he was professor of history and head of the history department at King's College London. In 1973, he moved to the United States on his appointment to a professorship at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. In 1990, he returned to the United Kingdom following his appointment as Regius Professor of Modern History. He retired as Regius Professor in 1997 and is now Regius Professor Emeritus and an honorary fellow of Oriel College, to which the Regius Chair is attached. He holds honorary doctorates from several universities in Great Britain, the United States, and Spain, where he has received many honors, including the Prince of Asturias Prize. In 1994, he was knighted for his services to history. He has visited Mexico on many occasions, either for sightseeing or for research in its archives and libraries, and has many friends and contacts in Mexico with colleagues as well. He is a winner of the Balzan Prize for History in 1997. He is the author of many books and articles on the history of early modern Europe, and in particular on the history and civilization of Spain and its overseas empire. Among his works, we find Imperial Spain, 1469-1716, The Old World and the New, 1492 to 1650, Empires of the Atlantic World, 1500 to 1800, and History in the Making. Sir John, welcome. Thank you for accepting the invitation of the Center for Mexican Studies. And I wish to begin this conversation by asking you how you became interested in the Spanish world, in the Hispanic world, really.
Well, thank you very much for your generous introduction. I became interested really by chance, as happens so much in the life of a historian or anybody else. At the end of my first year in Cambridge, I saw an advertisement in the undergraduate newspaper. There was an old army van, and the person who bought it was doing a tour, going to do a grand tour of the Iberian Peninsula. And so I thought I'd sign up. There was still a place on it. And we spent about 6 weeks. We drove across France, entered in northern Spain, and drove right the way around the peninsula, including Lisbon as well. We went to, in particular, to Madrid, but Salamanca, Seville, and Barcelona. So I got a real sense of the country. And of course, it was a Spain emerging from the Spanish Civil War, very poverty stricken, a lot of hungry kids, especially in the streets of Seville. We had no money ourselves, so we would sleep out in the fields until some angry farmer woke us up early in the morning, or in third-class pension. But we had a great time, and somehow something about the country gripped me, made me excited, because the previous generation had vivid memories of the Spanish Civil War. Some of them wouldn't go back to Spain because of Franco. And since I was a later generation, I didn't feel quite the same inhibitions. And I began to think that there were opportunities for research by an outsider on Spanish history, which was very narrowly focused and nationalist, under the Franco regime. It was a history which tried to show that Spain preserved against a communist and atheist civilization the transcendental values of Spain in the years of its greatness, the time of Ferdinand Isabella, of Charles V, and Philip II. So that's how it all began. And I thought when I got back to Cambridge that I'd try and find out a bit more reading. I didn't have any Spanish at this stage. Tried a bit more background reading, found that Spain was not well treated in these books. The Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend of Spanish civilization, was very powerful in the Anglo-American world. So it was a very negative vision of Spain, enhanced by the fact of the Franco dictatorship. So that was really my starting point. And when I got my degree at Cambridge, I decided I want to research, and I thought there's an open field here for a foreigner, a disinterested foreigner, perhaps to contribute something. Foreigners, it's always more difficult for foreigners, but there are some things they see which local historians or national historians don't see. And I thought I might be able to contribute in that way. And so at that point, I began to start trying to read books in Spanish, really teaching myself Spanish, actually. I was more or less self-taught. I went to a 2 weeks summer course on Spanish in Santiago de Compostela, but otherwise nobody taught me. But I began to secure Spanish friends, and I gave a series. Well, first of all, I decided to do a year's reading in this country, in the Spanish materials in the British Museum, as it then was, now the British Library, to get an idea of what the handwriting is like and so on. And so I spent my first year in this country really learning Spanish, learning to read Spanish, learning to read Spanish handwriting of the 16th and 17th centuries, which is easier with the official hand than with private hands on the whole. And so I set off for Spain itself for a year's research in, I suppose it was 1953 probably. And I went straight to Simancas, the great archive near Valladolid, which was set up by Charles V and Philip II in particular as the archive for Spanish papers. And by this time I'd become very interested in the figure of the Count Duke of Olivares, as he later became, Gaspar de Guzman, the second Count of Olivares, a junior branch of the Guzman family in Seville. And I thought I'd look at his domestic reform program. And I was interested in that because the standard picture of this period is of Spain in decline. And after the death of Philip II in 1598, it seems like a story of Spain going downhill all the way until it loses its hegemony, European hegemony, in the 1640s. And I thought I'd have a look and see what his intentions were, whether he was concerned by decline and what he planned to do about it. And I spent some time looking at the documentation of the Council of State in Simancas, a lot of state papers, discussions, consultas as they were known, of the Council of State, making recommendations to the king. But I couldn't find anything other than Olivares' own contribution speeches in the Council of State, any of his own papers about his domestic reform program. And I was very depressed about this. And then I discovered, to my horror, that when he was given leave to retire in 1643 by the king, having been favorite and first minister of Philip IV, who came to the throne in 1621, when he was given leave to retire, he was allowed to take all his state papers with him. And by succession, he had no surviving male heir or heir of any sort. Then it moved by marriage through the Guzman family into the Duke of Alba's family. There was a big fire in the Duke of Alba's Liria Palace in Madrid in the 1790s, possibly deliberately set by an angry servant. And practically the entire archive was destroyed, which was not only Olivares' own papers, but all the papers he collected of predecessors, other Spanish ministers and so on. So I was absolutely shattered by this. I thought I couldn't come home after 3 months or so in Spain with nothing to show for my researches. And I realized I had to rethink in some way. And the two great events of Olivares' period of power, and those that really precipitated his fall, were the revolt of Catalonia in the spring and summer of 1640, which breaks away from Madrid and tries to set up as an independent republic on its own. And a few months later, a coup d'etat in Lisbon. Portugal had been joined to the Spanish crown, to the crown of Castile in 1580. And Portuguese who disliked Spanish rule or government interference by Madrid staged a coup d'etat and took over the government. And there was a king in waiting in Portugal, the Braganza family, and he was proclaimed King John IV of an independent kingdom of Portugal. So that fortunately, because there are no papers effectively on the Portuguese revolt, I turned to Barcelona, which has this wonderfully rich archive of the Crown of Aragon, Crown of Aragon consisting of the Principality of Catalonia, the Kingdom of Aragon, the Kingdom of Valencia and Mallorca, and some of the Italian conquests, southern Italy, in the late Middle Ages. And I found that the Council of Aragon, responsible for the government of Catalonia, but sitting in Madrid, all the deliberations of that council were there. So I was able to read up the back and try to work out the background of that revolt, starting around about 1600, going right up to the revolt, to the peasants' revolt in the first instance, and then the declaration of independence, and followed by effectively a French takeover of Catalonia, because the French were willing to help the Catalans, but only if they agreed to become a protectorate of France. And in fact, Catalonia Hello.
Oh, hello, good morning. I'm calling from Uplivad in Oxford.
Oh, look, I'm just Zooming a conference. But can I just say it's for my wife, Ana Elliott, and she's run out of batteries. So whether you could post her some new batteries for her hearing aids. What's what?
What's the postcode?
OX4 4EG.
Echo Golf.
Yes, that's right.
Ana Elliott.
That's it.
I post the batteries to right.
Thank you very much. Bye.
No problem, no problem.
So that Catalonia becomes a French protectorate, and thanks to French support, it survives separately from the rest of Spain from 1640 up to 1652, when Philip IV, the Royal Army, finally captures Barcelona, which surrenders. But in a sense, it's only a sort of semi-victory for the government of Philip IV. By this time, Olivares was gone. It was only a semi-victory because in effect, what shall I say? The acceptance of privileges and liberties, those were restored as part of the deal. And Catalonia then formed part of what was known by historians today as a composite monarchy, which means that each part of that composite monarchy, whether it's Catalonia or Valencia, Mallorca or Naples, preserved its own liberties, laws, privileges. And that system, which was practiced by the Habsburg dynasty in Spain, by the Casa de Austria, the House of Austria, that survived until 1700, when the male line of the dynasty expired with the death of Carlos II. A French monarch took over Bourbon, the future Philip V, and he set out to abolish the laws and liberties of the Crown of Aragon as rebellious states, and a system known as the Nueva Planta, the new system was introduced, a much more centralizing system run from Madrid with much closer control of all the parts of the peninsula.
So you were first interested in all the comings and goings of the Catalonian state, the Iberian Peninsula, no, as well, Portugal. That's and afterwards, it is that you focused your research on the expansion of Spain and the trips of discovery and the foundation of the viceroyalties of America.
Yes. I gave a course of lectures on the history of early modern Spain in Cambridge, which then became my book, 1963. It was published, Imperial Spain. And at the same time, same year, in fact, I published a book on the revolt of the Catalans, about the background to the Catalan revolt. So those two books came out in 1963. And when in Imperial Spain, I did a very sort of standard short summary of the Spanish conquest of a new empire in America, notably Mexico and Peru. But I realized it was very thin standard stuff. And I had to mentally cross the Atlantic, taking on board what the conquistadores and then the colonists, their mental attitudes, their behavior, what they brought from Spain, the problems they met in encountering indigenous civilizations of which Europe had never heard. And I found this absolutely fascinating. So I became, in a sense, at that moment, both a historian of the Imperio de las Indias, the American Indian Empire, and also of the Atlantic world in general. And those have been some of the key points. And I've always been trying to compare and contrast what's happening in the peninsula, what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic, what's happening in North America too, and try and produce at all times a general synthesis. I think it's very important, especially given the anti-Spanish attitudes of Anglo-American readership. It's very important to show that the positive side as well as the negative side, which is enormous, of the encounter of these civilizations. And so that's really what got me going. And those are the ways I've been thinking ever since. But
could you tell us, sorry, a little bit about the way in which both enterprises compare, the one by Spain and the one by England?
Well, this is what I tried to do in the book, which I published 2004, thereabouts, 2006, Empires of the Atlantic World, which runs from 1492 right up to the 1830s and the independence movements, both of the United States on one side and of Spanish America or Latin America on the other side. And I try to show that there's a good deal of negative in the British record as well. The Spaniards at least set out to try and convert the Indians, persuade them, civilize them in the language of the day. The English were much happier expelling them to the middle of the continent and clearing away the Indians who moved westwards to escape English control. There's much less emphasis on evangelization. There's a little bit in New England, but not a great deal. So that's one example of a major difference between the two approaches. But the English did have the Spanish example to look at, both the negative and the positive sides of Spanish. So there was a great deal of influence by the Spanish world on British attitudes to conquest and colonization.
Yes. Regarding the way in which they mixed and married.
That's right, intermarriage, for instance, mestizaje, which really doesn't exist on a major scale. And then, of course, the incorporation of Africans. African slaves are introduced very early into the Iberian world. Of course, they come very strongly from the colonization of Virginia and later. The Portuguese are responsible for a very intensive slave trade, linking Africa, Lisbon, and the Americas. So that what I realized in looking at all this was the importance of reading contemporary chronicles. I learned a great deal just by reading Las Casas, obviously, who's a very influential figure in the attempt to convert and evangelize. But there are so many interesting chronicles. Acosta, for instance, at the end of the 16th century, who does this great geographical history, environmental history in some respects too, of the Spanish conquest and colonization of America. So that I was studying and reading these chronicles and absolutely fascinated. And I was asked to give a series of lectures at Queen's University, Belfast in the late 60s, the Wiles lectures. And I gave them on what I call the old world and the new, trying to show not the impact of Europe on America, but the impact of America on Europe, and looked at things that way around, which again was a pioneering book at that stage. It's been much imitated. I got quite a number of things wrong, inevitably, but at least I sort of set out the possibilities of that. And they've been followed in conferences and criticized and accepted and absorbed and so on. So that was important. And then the other great thing that happened to me was that, it was, it's fascinating studying a part of the world you don't know. I'd never been to the Americas. I managed to get a grant from a foundation to spend a sabbatical year, which I had from Cambridge, touring North and South America. And after about 3 months in New York, making contact with North American historians, United States historians of Spanish America, including particularly Louis Hankey, Columbia University, to which I was nominally attached, who'd done a great deal of work on the conquest and settlement of Spanish America. My wife and I flew down from the States to Mexico City. This was beginning of February 1963. And we spent 3 months, February till the beginning of May, in Mexico, mostly Mexico City. I made for the archives and the libraries, which I found were pretty chaotic, some of them, but some rich material. I wasn't sure what sort of subject I was going to do, but I was getting interested in the society, colonial society of Viceregal Mexico, Nueva España in particular. And I was very interested to meet Mexican historians and literary specialists and so on. And I must say that the Mexicans we've met within the first week in Mexico City, my wife and I were getting invitations to come and lunch or supper, either in restaurants, in people's houses and so on. The British Council was very helpful. The ambassador invited us, and we were introduced to a number of people who became very influential in my future relations with Mexico. And one of the most impressive and striking was Edmundo Gorman, who had written this famous book, The Invention of America, about how America was invented by Europeans, was a concept. And he invited us to his lovely house outside Mexico City. He took us on drives to different parts of Mexico and central Mexico, that is. And it's extremely generous, a very subtle mind, very aristocratic. I think it was a pleasure to him to talk to foreigners who were interested in the history of his own country. And apart from him, we also met within the first 2 or 3 weeks, one or two other people who were extremely influential in my later career. In particular, a couple, Jan Bazant, who is a Czech exile, very right-wing, who escaped at the time from Czechoslovakia at the time of the Nazi takeover, moved to Mexico, married a Mexican wife, Emma Bazant, who was a very lively, outgoing character. He was a rather dour character. And they, first of all, invited us to their house. They had a nice house at Tepoztlan, just outside Mexico City. And then every time we went to Mexico in the 1970s and 80s, they would meet us at the airport, drive us to their house and take us right over the country. We went to Yucatan, we went to Puebla, Oaxaca, Acapulco, and up to Zacatecas and the mining area there. So I got a wonderful sightseeing, makes all the difference. And the thing that most impressed me, I think, was a sense of space in Spanish America. You get these cities with the same sort of layout, the gridiron layout, and it's an urban civilization that the Spaniards create. But you also get this enormous sense as you stand in these cities, looking out from them, of endless space. And this was something that, of course, you can't read about in books, but has a tremendous effect on one's vision of the world one is working on. So that that worked out really very well from our point of view. I was left Cambridge, was appointed to the chair of history at King's College London in 1968. I've had enough of life in Cambridge. I gave a course on the conquest and colonization of Mexico, which produced 1 or 2 pupils who then went on to be historians of Mexico, like Jonathan Israel, for instance, whose first book was on society in early 17th century, New Spain. And right to the end, I had 1 or 2 pupils, Cayetana Alvarez de Toledo, when I arrived in Oxford in the 1990s, who wrote a marvelous book on Palafox as Viceroy of Viceroy and Bishop, interim Viceroy of Mexico in early 1640s. So that I've always had that chance to train and introduce people to Mexican civilization as well. And I've kept in close touch with generations of Mexican historians. One who became, and is very active today, is Oscar Mazin, who again, got the idea of an Atlantic approach, which I think is very important. One of the things, the defects of Mexican historiography, as I found it was pretty enclosed. It was positivistic. It didn't even take into account much of what was happening in other parts of Spanish America. And I wanted to expand not only my mental horizons, but also their mental horizons, see the enormous importance of thinking about Spain. And one of the problems about Spanish history, literature, and so on, and the way it's been treated, is that they've been enclosed subjects within the context of nationalism. And I felt this just wasn't good enough. One wants a much more cosmopolitan approach, and you begin to realize the richness of these Atlantic civilizations, effectively. And each viceroyalty, every viceroyalty or governorship in Spanish Empire in America has its differences from other ones. We spent a certain amount of time in Guatemala, for instance, which has quite different attitudes and problems to those we found in Mexico itself. And the same is true of Peru, which was another eye-opener, going to Lima and then up to Cusco and getting a sense of the survival of the old Inca and indeed pre-Inca civilization in Cusco. There's much more of a survival than you find in Mexico City, where there's been much more of a sort of general assimilation. But of course, the archaeological finds in Mexico City, the Templo Mayor and so on, again give one a very vivid sense of the extraordinary richness of this pre-conquest civilization in Mexico, a lot of which was swept away, but a lot of which survived in one form or another, even by people who accepted Spanish values. They lived mentally sometimes in two worlds, which interlocked. They were good Christians, or thought they were, but at the same time, they remembered the ancient gods. They assimilated some of those attitudes into their approach to Christianity. You only have to see one or two of these indios, as they used to be known and still are known, praying in these Rococo churches. Ocotlan, for instance, is a wonderful church, to realize the fervor of devotion. But it's not perhaps the kind of Protestant or modern Catholic theology and religion which you and I are used to.
Wonderful. And for a time you focused as well on the figure of Hernán Cortés, right? And his mental world, the things that inspired him.
Yes, I got absolutely fascinated by Cortés because he seemed to stand out from the other conquistadores and colonists. And there are mysteries about his career. It was a sort of lower nobility of southern Spain, Extremadura, which produced so many of the conquistadores. He was at Salamanca for some time. Nobody knows. He doesn't seem to have been registered, but he picked up quite a lot. He was a literate man, very literate. I think was very interested in the Spanish past, the role of his family in the past. Was very impressed by the legal treatise of the Siete Partidas of the reign of Alfonso X of Castile, Alfonso the Sabio, Alfonso the Wise, and got this sense of the bien común, the common good, of the importance of precedent, the importance of the community over and against a tyrannical ruler. And although Charles V, who'd just been elected emperor, Holy Roman Emperor at the time when Cortés arrived in Mexico in July of 1519, in spite of that, because of it, Charles had appointed a governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, as he was called, who was organizing these expeditions for reconnaissance of the Mexican coast, which was gradually coming into view, and Yucatan in particular. And all he wanted, he sent off Hernán Cortés, who was his secretary, to reconnoiter the coast. And Cortés, being a clever man, saw that he had a chance here to break away from the government and the control of Diego Velázquez as governor of Cuba. And he did it in the name of the Commonwealth by setting up the common good. On arrival, he took his ships into Veracruz, the port there. He immediately founded the Villa Rica, the rich city of Veracruz, of his own soldiers and expeditionary force, as a community, set up rules of municipal government, just like those he found in Spain. And then he could write to the king and say, we've been tyrannically ruled by the governor of Cuba. I'm now conquering a great new empire, which is appearing before us, the empire of Moctezuma. And I want to hand this empire to your majesty with no interference by the governor of Cuba or by any inferior officials. And because he was able to send back the first riches and objets d'art from Mexico, Charles was enormously impressed. They arrived in Antwerp. People were overwhelmed by the beauty of these Mexican pre-conquest artifacts. Dürer in particular, as an artist, describes his impression, enormous impression they made on him. And so from that point on, Charles very much supported Hernán Cortés, at least up to the final surrender of 1521, August 1521, the quincentennials were celebrating this moment, the surrender of Tenochtitlan after the death or murder of Moctezuma. Cuauhtémoc took over. Cuauhtémoc was captured, tortured, and put to death. And at that point, the Spaniards effectively took over the whole hierarchical mechanism that the Narcos de Mexica had put in place, which was a very controlling empire from Tenochtitlan. And this, they just simply superimposed Spanish institutions, Spanish rules, many Spanish people, but by no means all, on the old Mexican system. And it was only by degrees that the nobility, either through assimilation or through expiring the end of their lines, and at that point did the Spaniards, in a sense, really control, but they were never in full control. It was impossible. I mean, even the distances there are enormous. And you have to remember this, again, this question of distance. You know, it takes a year for a letter from Madrid to reach Lima, telling the viceroy, giving the viceroy orders. By that time, the whole situation has changed in Peru, and so the instructions become irrelevant, as it were. So this is, it's government at a distance, or possibly tyranny at a distance, and non-government very often, and resistance to government. And that's what makes it fascinating, all these possible responses by different sections of society. And at the same time, I got very interested in, I mean, I was naturally concerned by the whole question of the decline of Spain, which was the framework in which I did my work and published my book on Olivares, Statesman in an Age of Decline. But I increasingly began to appreciate that, after all, the decline of Spain, the age of decline of Spain in the early 17th century, is also the Spanish, the golden age of Spanish art and literature. And I was very lucky in moving to the States and living in Princeton. Almost around the corner from me was a professor of Spanish art history at Columbia University, at New York University, Jonathan Brown, working already a specialist on Velázquez. We got talking and we realized that if we pooled our different skills, with Jonathan working on the actual artistic creations and me working on the historical context in which they occurred, we might be able to write a book together which would illuminate both the question of politics and decline, but also the question of the productivity in the arts. And we had a tremendous time. We went to the archives in Spain together in particular, and we published this book, A Palace for a King, in the 1980s it was now, I think, first edition, which was an attempt at a total history of a pleasure palace built for Philip IV by Olivares on the outskirts of Madrid, run up at great speed in the 1630s. And we tried to reconstruct the intentions behind the palace, the kind of work that was involved, the financing of it, and particularly interested in its central hall, the Salón de Reinos, as it's known, because the realms of Spain are represented by their coats of arms on the ceiling of this room. And it became, although it was intended originally for dances and theatrical productions and so on, it eventually became, or already in the mid-1630s, a ceremonial hall for official occasions. And the king and Olivares commissioned a series of paintings to go round the wall, which would emphasize, on the one hand, the victories of a glorious reign, and at the same time, the continuity of the dynasty in the person of the heir to the throne, the young Baltasar Carlos, who was seen horseback with his parents on either side and the far end of the Hall of Realms. And round the hall, you get 12 battle paintings showing the victories of the reign, one of them showing Olivares really masterminding things and crowning the king with laurels. And between the paintings, higher up, was a series commissioned from Zurbarán, another important South Andalusian painter of the time, of the life and the labors of Hercules, who is regarded as the founding father of the dynasty. And of course, the most famous picture today of the Hall of Realms was the surrender of Breda by the Maurice of Nassau, the Dutch commander, to Spinola, the commander of the Spanish army of Flanders, in the 1625. So this itself is a great historical treasure. And Jonathan and I have been campaigning for the last 40 years to get it restored to something like its original appearance, because all the paintings are in the Prado, either on display or stuck in the basement. And I think our campaign is, at last, 40 years on, nearing success. It's been accepted as a project by the government and by the trustees of the Prado as a suitable means of commemorating the founding of the Prado as a public museum in 1819. And so I'm hoping that within the next 3 or 4 years, we shall get at least an evocation of that room, which will make it virtually unique in Europe. And there's an equivalent of in the banqueting hall, Whitehall, which has got the Rubens ceiling, but the decorations have gone, the wall decorations. And the Palais de Luxembourg in Paris, which was also rather similar and was Richelieu played a part, great rival of Olivares, Cardinal Richelieu, was promoting that. And that was burnt down in the Franco-Spanish War of 1870. So that it would be an act of widespread European interest to have this Hall of Realms recovered. And in addition to this, during my years working on the biography of Olivares, I found a research assistant in Seville, and together we began publishing documents, the major documents. We, again, going all around European archives, Britain and Italy, as well as Spain itself, and private archives. And we published the first volume of documents in the 1980s. And I'm afraid Jose Francisco La Peña died very young, but I revived the project with Fernando Negredo, who's a historian in Madrid, who worked on the reign of Philip IV. And we've just published the second volume a few weeks ago in Spain, which is a massive tome, which is a correspondence between Olivares and Philip IV's younger brother, the Cardinal Infante, who is the governor of the Spanish Low Countries and the commander of the Army of Flanders. And although inevitably, naturally, this is much of the correspondence is of greatest interest to military historians and historians interested in how the Army of Flanders was kept going and the problems of governing Flanders at this moment. But the Olivares side of the correspondence has quite a lot of personal details and a fascinating use of words. And there are tremendous opportunities, I think, for some philological expert to look at that, see how far these are refrains and proverbs which are in general use in Spain of early 17th century, and how far they're thought up by Olivares on the spur of the moment. Because you can see a lot of these are handwritten letters. Cardinal Infante's are much more official letters on the whole, dictated to his secretary generally. But the Olivares correspondence, another open field for somebody with the necessary skills. So I've had a great time.
That's fantastic. And it shows how important it is for the idea of empire to be represented both scripturally through documentation and graphically, pictographically. These wonderful paintings that celebrate the achievements of the moment, that have relevance and are foundational for what is to come, no? Really, well, or ideally that what was inspired their creation.
Absolutely. And it's unfortunate that the Museum of the Americas in Madrid could be much better, I think. It's a bit didactic, and it's not, it doesn't include so many objects of really first-class importance for which they don't have space. So that's another project that somebody else, I hope, will take on and develop.
And another very important thing that I would like to hear your opinion of is this idea of transnational history, a history that goes beyond the narrow-mindedness that sometimes characterizes historical research by restricting itself to a single nation, because it never works that way, right? And at the present moment in which communications have grown exponentially, and we are beginning to realize the importance of considering ourselves global citizens. Both transnational law and transnational history become an imperative, or what is your opinion?
Well, all borders have become porous nowadays. There's no cutting off. And so something like Brexit, it's a look back into the past, dominated by a nostalgic sense of a past that never was. And you know, you don't understand the Irish problem or the Scottish problem unless you look back to the Middle Ages and the early years, the founding of these societies and the key events in their history. And as soon as you do that, you realize that nothing is enclosed here, that there are constant contacts, outside influences, however much you try to avoid those outside influences. And I think the vital thing that historians have to do is to learn, well, first of all, to show curiosity. First of all, not to pull down the shutters on any point, but to develop a sense of empathy, even towards figures who are not attractive. I mean, Oliver was brutal in many ways, not a person I would have enjoyed very much having conversation with, although he's very intelligent, literate, and well-read. But all the same, he was a bully. And you have to somehow step into his shoes mentally and try and see what made him tick, without at the same time being seduced by the personality. So you have to keep your distance, but at the same time, put yourself into his shoes. And it's a difficult balancing act, but it's one that I think good historians have learned to do over the centuries. And that, I think, is absolutely critical for the future of history, the discipline. And history should link up as much as possible with literature, the theatre, productions, and every kind of literary production, because the mutual influence, I think literary specialists who have no idea of the historical context are losing out a great deal, which it would explain some of the books and works they're studying. And the same is true of historians, if they don't take into account the importance of somebody like Quevedo or Góngora in the mental world of the people, the politicians, the statesmen, the bureaucrats who they're studying.
So what would be your recommendation for young historians, in particular young Mexican historians?
I think they should become more aware of the history of Spain. The division between Mexican history and Spanish history is too great. And the same is true of the Spaniards, who until the latest generation haven't really absorbed Mexico or Peru into their work. So that, again, it's a question of expanding horizons, trying to understand the relationship across the Atlantic and across the globe nowadays. And of course, the temptations are great, as well as the advantages of digitalization. It's too easy now to consult books online using a search tool and not reading the book. And this, I think, has had very prejudicial consequences for many younger historians. For heaven's sake, if you see what looks like an interesting book, an interesting quotation, follow it up and read the book. Don't just take that and look for the same words in another book. And I think this is the way forward. You've always got to think twice about what you're doing, why you're doing it, what's the best way of doing it. There's no formula. You have to work out your own system. I mean, I've taken an incredible number of notes all the time. I'm ashamed of the vast quantities of paper I've generated over the course of my life. Mm-hmm. But it's my way of doing it. And, you know, I belong to the pre-digital age.
That is wonderful, Sir John. Well, Thank you very much for this fantastic interview where you have shown us a summary of your wonderful career, which you have clearly enjoyed throughout the years. I am sure that you will inspire many viewers, many of the viewers, whether Mexican or from other countries, because now access is open for all. And I wish you the very best.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure.
I'm going, oh,